Chapter 4 The Russian Trinity. In Rostov-on-Don, in the land of the Cossacks, I sat one Sunday afternoon with an apostle of Jesus and a disciple of Lenin. The apostle was a gray-haired pastor of the Evangelical Baptist faith. The disciple was his granddaughter, a university graduate in the field of geophysics. My interpreter was a solemn, composed young man, a party member, with a will to work. Throughout the morning he had carted me around from church to church in this lovely city on the Don River, and now, in late afternoon, seemed as eager for another interview as I. He had an academic interest in religion, but in all his 33 years he had never attended church. The four of us sat together at a homemade table in an arbor in the backyard of the minister's home. The minister's wife had served us tea and Russian pastries. The flies were swarming and the day was hot, but at that there could not have been a better setting for our conference than this small yard behind the four-room parsonage. Here the minister often sat preparing his sermons, and here the student frequently came with her books in geophysical research. Religion and science, so to say, had often held a rendezvous here, but never with an American listening in. In Russia, no one tries very hard to convince anyone about the value or need for spiritual faith. There is no evangelistic zeal, as we know it in the United States. No one sermonizes in public squares, preaches in tents, or testifies on street corners. Such demonstrations are not actually forbidden, but they could be stopped by the law which prohibits teaching religion in groups of more than 3. Ours was not a teaching session on this Sunday afternoon. It was a friendly get-together, arranged for me through the cooperation of a tourist. The student sat across the table from me, a pretty, dark-haired girl of 23, with a pleasant and confident way, but for the lack of rouge and lipstick she looked the part of almost any American co-ed. In Russia, education is a passion. It is also highly competitive. This girl was hand-picked for special study in a country which graduates twice as many scientists each year as we do in the United States. She was an out-and-out rationalist and an active member of the Young Communist League. The minister, a resigned, humble man, sat at the head of the table, opposite my interpreter. Earlier I had visited his church, a very lowly place that had been adapted out of a residence damaged in the war more than 10 years ago. The ambitious congregation of 500 working people had equipped it with pulpit and pews, and were building onto it now because attendance was growing. One of the members took me around proudly to show me the scripture text that adorned the walls. The texts were full of hope and promise. The meek shall inherit the earth. One sheep and one shepherd. The path of the just is as a shining light. You could never imagine the minister preaching hellfire and damnation, but you would have expected him to shake his head solemnly over the state of religion in Russia, for he impressed me as one who carried the weight of faith in the country dedicated to atheism. I had the feeling he probably spent his secret moments praying that God would produce some sort of miracle to help his cause. I expected him to speak his mind, grimly and without excuse. He did not. He did exactly what other members of the clergy whom I had interviewed had done. He said with steady emphasis, "The Church and communism can work together. There is no reason why they cannot." I looked at him inquiringly. My glance must have shown him my surprise. It may have betrayed the dilemma which was catching up with me more and more every time I interviewed a Russian clergyman or talked religion to a Russian believer. How wide was the gap between what these people told me and what they were really thinking? Did this suspicion of duplicity exist only in my mind, or was it actually a fact all down the ministerial and priestly line? Not a single churchman would say a single word against the state. No one questioned any governmental action or criticized any governmental decree. I was constantly given the impression that separation of church and state had resulted in a new and happy era of cooperation between the two. Now this seasoned cleric was also assuring me that Christianity and communism were compatible. "Can Christ and Lenin ever be reconciled?" I asked. His answer was quick and eager. "The love of God," he said, "reconciles all men." "Is there no conflict between Christ and Lenin?" I asked. His gaze hovered on me a moment. He listened and smiled patiently while the interpreter translated my question. He glanced at his granddaughter as if inquiring what she would say in answer to this. Finally he said, "There is a conflict, of course, but there are many areas where Christ and Lenin can agree." One minute I was sure he meant it. The next minute I was equally sure he did not mean it. This was part of the dilemma. His eyes met mine. There was an impenetrable region I could not reach. It was not fair for me to judge him, and yet, as he looked at me with a prolonged and guarded glance, I felt he was trying to advise me that there are times when one is forced to hide behind half-truths. There was a deep longing about him. There was a look that seemed to say, "I trust the interpreter, and I trust my granddaughter, but I cannot get out of my mind the fear of being overheard." The days of suspicion are past here in Russia, and yet they have not passed. I put the question to the student, "Can Christ and Lenin be reconciled?" "Christ is a myth," she said confidently, as if she had got her evidence from some unimpeachable source. "Are the disciples also mythological?" I asked. She looked at me as though this had never occurred to her. She looked at her grandfather as if for help. "I do not know," she said. The minister chuckled good-naturedly. "Well, granddaughter," he said, "it is a good question." She agreed, and said she would give it thought. "Do you ever go to church?" I inquired. She shook her head negatively. "I feel no need for the church or for religion," she said. At this point, she gave the pretext of being coldly dogmatic, and reminded me that party members are not permitted to belong to a church. She explained why this was, so communism is based upon materialistic philosophy. The true communist is always an atheist. Then there is also the matter of divided loyalties, the all-sufficiency of the communist program, opposition to the superstitions which the Church perpetuates, and the intrigue which has always been part of the Church's history. All of this was spoken confidently, as if she got it out of a book. I was sure she believed what she was saying. I was equally sure she had doubts about it. This too was part of the dilemma. There was a longing in her eyes, and a questioning she could not hide. As you pursue your studies in the field of geophysics, I asked, do you become more or less convinced that there is an intelligence or power behind the universe? Neither more nor less convinced, she said with a toss of her head. There is no need for any external cause or first cause. The material world has no beginning and no end. Matter and motion give us all the answers we need. The more we learn, the more we realize that what were once considered mysteries are really not so mysterious. But, granddaughter, asked the minister, where does matter get its elements, and where does motion get its motion? They are inherent in themselves, she said. Well, well, he sighed, I do not want to mix with you when it comes to science. Then he said to me with a wistful smile, but sometimes she does mix with me when it comes to religion. I tell her that faith, as well as science, has its miracles. We went on to talk about communism and the Church, and about all that has happened to the Church and Christianity in Russia since the Soviets came into power. Here, separated by 2 generations, was Russia, old and new. Here was religion on the defensive, challenged by the fresh, frank spirit of youth, religion with more convictions than it dared proclaim, and youth with more answers than it could justify. Here was young communism, exposed to the quiet, reflective influence of Christianity, and more sensitive to it than it dared admit. Between the longing that existed in each, the religious patriarch and the young scientist, there suddenly loomed the gigantic, unseen, but sharply felt power of the state, a state so strong, so compact, so absolute, that it stood as a watchman entrenched in every life. Again I felt its power channeled through the personal life and thought of its subjects. It dominated their minds. It held its people within the unrelenting web of its power. It would not let the minister voice his deepest convictions. It would not let the student dream her dreams. And as I sat there listening to my interpreter unhesitatingly translating, repeating, explaining, he seemed like a mechanism created by the state. I felt that, in a way, I was being influenced and guided by the state. Everything that I had heard back in America about Russia's regimentation of the souls of men broke over me with stunning reality. I wanted to say, let's tell each other what we are really thinking. Let's come out from behind our duplicity. We could not. We did not. I suppose we dared not. For 40 years, the world's strongest dictatorship has molded the mind of Russia, old and new. For 40 years, it has held a strangling grip on the thought of its people. Through the most intensively trained, highly organized, and perfectly systematized network of authority in all the world, it has woven every area of life into a pattern of solidarity. Nowhere was this more evident than in the history of what had happened to religion in Russia since 1917, and as that story now unfolded, I wondered whether communism is not even more powerful in its ability to control the masses than most of us have realized. I was asked to remember that the pre-revolutionary church was an instrument of the czars, and that it lived under the illusion that religion could never be destroyed. I was also reminded that it was a disunited church, a church of indifference and a church asleep. When it awoke in 1917 and found the Bolsheviks in power, it tried in one leap to become the church militant. Frantically, it urged its members to oppose the Bolshevik servants of Satan, warning them that the Christian flock and the bloody Bolshevik horde must be considered enemies until the end of time. Priests and pastors, bishops and patriarchs spurred their people to fight and resist the Red Revolutionists. They organized the Warriors of Jesus, a counter-revolutionary force, and blessed their weapons. They prepared slogans about pitting God against Lenin and Christ against Antichrist. They also began talking about a united Christian front. In 1917, Old Catholics, Old Believers, Anglicans, and Orthodox decided it was time to get together. The leaders never actually united, but they talked about it and consoled each other with the belief that the Russian church could never die because of the fervor of the Russian people. They said they were the most religious people in the world, and soon they would rise up against the Reds. They prophesied that God would put a speedy end to Bolshevik power. The Reds responded by looting the churches. Then a mighty patriarch named Tikhon decided it was high time to do something about this blasphemy. He vowed he would do something about it. He did. He excommunicated the government. He censored the Reds in the name of Almighty God, and ordered them out of the church's fellowship. Some compared him to Elijah, calling down fire from heaven upon the priests of Baal. But Tikhon conjured up no such miracle. The only thing he did was to get himself arrested while the new rulers, more powerful than the czars, plundered more churches, stripped the altars, and paraded the streets, stopping only long enough to burn Tikhon in effigy. Soon, all churches were nationalized, and church property became the possession of the People's Party. Soon, church doors began to close. As they slammed shut, one by one, authorized reports began to reach the people. The government explained that church treasures had been confiscated and churches robbed only in order to feed the starving and clothe the naked and help the sick among Russia's war-torn and suffering people. A crust of bread is better than a cross, they said, especially when there was an excess of crosses. They declared they had taken nothing out of the churches which in any way infringed upon the practices of the cult. Some people, hearing that gold and silver and precious jewels had been seized to feed the common people, felt this was a form of religion in action. Young communists felt this way. So did people who resented the riches of the clergy and the hoarded wealth of the church, with its monasteries and lavish parishes. Perhaps they figured the Soviets were more religious than the religionists. Certainly, they were more realistic. Here at last was the fulfillment of Lenin's promise that communism is a united league of class-conscious, progressive fighters, pledged to the welfare and liberation of the working class, and opposed to the inconsistencies of the Christians who profess charity but oppress the masses. Let all churches everywhere take notice, they said, that atheism is more spiritual than organized religion. But just when many Russians felt that communism had some semblance of mercy, and that the looting of the churches and the closing of cathedrals might be justified, the Bolsheviks seized 45 clergymen, found them guilty of crimes against the government, and put them to death. Priests and members of the laity who showed hostility were speedily jailed. The old minister had lived through all of this, and yet he was telling me that communism and the church can and should work together, which had changed the more I wondered, church or state, that these should now be reconciled. At the height of the revolution, the church had branded the Soviets as beast and antichrist. When Tikhon's excommunication proved ineffective, when the people did not rally to support the church, the Holy Church Council of Russian Orthodoxy tried a new approach. Toward the close of 1917, it petitioned the Soviet government, requesting that the state recognize church legislation and that no law affecting the church be passed without the church's consent. It made other demands. It said, we must keep our religious feast days, and we request that these be public holidays, as they were in the past. We want our priests protected from insult and abuse. We petition you to make it unlawful for people to leave the church before they have reached the age of consent. Religious teaching in the schools must be orthodox teaching. The church's property should not be confiscated. The government must give the church a subsidy. In 1918, the Soviets replied. They said they had given the Holy Council's demands careful consideration and were prepared to tell the church exactly where religion stood in the new regime. No church and no religious society shall have the right to own property, they said, and all existing property of churches and religious societies will become the property of the state. We will permit you to use your churches on the basis of special arrangement with the local or central state authorities. You will no longer be permitted to keep civil records. Marriages will henceforth be secularized. Education will be secularized. The religious oath will be abolished. Teaching of religion will not be allowed in state, public, and private schools, where secular subjects are taught. There shall be no religious instruction to use under 18 in groups of more than 3. The church is separated from the state. Every citizen may adhere to any religion, or to no religion. No one is allowed to evade his civil duties on religious grounds. There will be no subsidies from the government, and no church will be allowed to accumulate property. To the young communist, as represented by the student geophysicist, this action was not merely right and equitable, it was necessary and inevitable. A government had finally arisen with the courage to expose a religion that had hidden beneath the cloak of sanctity, that had set itself up as inviolable and divine, while actually being instrument of capitalism and the servant of the burgesses. Never before in history had the mask been torn from Christianity. Never before had the individual conscience been liberated and the souls of men set free. I asked whether the individual actually was free under communism. Is this not a major difference between Christianity and Marxism? Take the matter of contemplative knowledge, for example. The very idea of personal meditation is considered useless and a waste of time to the Marxist. Marx once said, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. Consciousness is social before it is individual," he argued. Who placed a higher value on the dignity of the individual than Christ? Was communism asking us to believe that collectivism put more sanctity upon man than did the Christian faith? My disciple of Lenin said that was exactly what the world was being asked to believe. She had her authority. Lenin, who masterminded the revolution, told his followers, "Say to the clergy, if you are sincere, you must stand for a complete separation of the church from the state, for a separation of the school from the church, and insist that religion be regarded entirely and unconditionally as a private matter. If you do not accept these consistent demands of liberty, it means that you are still a slave to inquisitorial traditions. It means that you are still hankering after government posts and the revenues attached to them. It means that you do not believe in the spiritual force of your weapon, and that you still wish to take bribes from the government. If this is so, the class-conscious Russian workers will declare ruthless war on you. The church not only obeyed, it capitulated. It had already abandoned the people to despair. The propaganda said, "Don't go to church. The church can do nothing for you. There is no God." "It looks that way," said the peasant. "It looks as if there is no God." It looked that way when, in 1923, the Holy Church Council met and went on record with a series of amazing statements. The present world is divided into two classes, capitalist exploiters and proletarians, upon whose toil and blood the capitalist world is building its welfare. In the whole world, said the Holy Council, only the Soviet government of Russia has ventured to struggle with this social evil. The Holy Council pronounces capitalism a deadly sin, and to fight it a sacred duty of the Christian. We see in the Soviet power a world leader for brotherhood, equality, and peace among nations. The council then went on to condemn the patriarch Ch4-5 as a traitor to the Church. There should be no place for counter-revolution in the Church, it said. The Soviet power is not a persecutor of the Church. It is the only one which attempts by state methods to realize the ideals of the kingdom of God. Every believing churchman must not only be an honest citizen, but he must with every measure work with the Soviet power for the realization upon earth of the ideals of the kingdom of God. Small wonder that the minister should tell me that communism and the church can work together. Even Ch4-5 finally came around to the Soviet side. He affixed his holy name to a confession which said, "All my anti-Soviet actions, with the exception of a few minor errors, are summed up in the statement of accusation of the Supreme Court, recognizing as correct the decision of the court to hold me responsible for anti-Soviet activity. I repent of these, my transgressions against the state. I am from now on no enemy of the Soviet power." So Ch4-5 was released, and clergymen who had alternated between pulpit and prison promised to be good. Russian Orthodoxy, which at one time had accused the Reds of murdering 1,000 priests and creating 10,000 martyrs, admitted they could have been wrong. So the churches began to reopen. Priests began to come out of hiding. Some said it was a victory for the Christian faith, and others said that a more devastating blow had never been dealt religion anywhere or at any time. How did the gray-haired minister feel about it? What did he think of religion in the USSR? Would he care to comment on the Soviet victory, if victory it was over the Church? What was his reaction to the persecution of ministers and priests in post-revolution years? He had his answer. We are free to preach and worship throughout our land. No ministers and priests were persecuted because of their faith. They were imprisoned and executed because of anti-government action, and then only after trial and due process of law. The student emphatically agreed, and what was there for me to do but to bury my dilemma and let the matter stand? Minister, student, and interpreter were all agreed, it seemed, that I was not to probe any deeper. They sat there looking at me, and I at them, and when I laughingly said I feared I was a poor inquisitor, the student smiled and said, "Be glad for that. Religious inquisitors were not good people." But we did manage to bring religious history somewhat up to date. It was agreed that between 1923 and 1929, religious organizations outside the Russian Orthodox group occasionally resisted Soviet decrees, but the government brought them into subjection, one by one, and accused religious groups in foreign countries of inciting local churches to rebel. During the 1930s, the government's attitude seemed to be, if you are foolish enough to worship, go ahead. In 1941, Russian statisticians presented some interesting figures. Nearly 50% of the people still held some form of religious belief. In 1917, there had been 54,000 churches in Russia, and in 1941, there were approximately 10,000 of these. Some 4,000 were Russian Orthodox. The others included Adventist, Evangelicals, Baptist, Mennonites, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Uniats, Muslim, Jewish groups, and certain Armenian Gregorian churches. Today, I was told, more than 20,000 churches were open and restored. The minister wanted to know if we had many atheists in the United States. I told him I had met several. They never actually denied God. They just ignored him. They did not belong to any godless society of the kind organized in Russia in 1926. They were usually individuals who were going through an intellectual conflict at a time when their old indoctrination was fighting it out with new scientific and philosophical ideas. These momentary atheists eventually found a faith somewhere among America's 250 denominational expressions, or if they did not, they never became very vocal about their anti-religious views. I explained that our atheists and agnostics in the United States were generally strongly individualistic. Usually they were more anti-church than anti-Christ. There is a religious consciousness in America and everywhere in the world for that matter, I said. Then I asked the student, is it possible that this consciousness exists here too, and communism is expressing it among Russian young people? In other words, do you find the security and joy in communism which people generally find in religion? The minister said, I will answer for her. She cannot answer because she has not entered into the religious experience. But grandfather, the girl warned, how can you answer for me when you have not entered into my experience? Well, well, said the old man, seemingly as proud of her wisdom as he was sorrowful about her faith. The girl wanted to triumph. I have found everything I need in communism, and in my work, she informed me quietly. Addressing her with a term of endearment, the minister asked, in great earnestness, but have you found peace, true peace, for your soul? Her words betrayed a touch of emotion as she replied, of course I've found peace. Now let us proceed to find peace for all the world. Yes, yes, agreed the minister. That is true. That is the greatest assignment. Again, I came back to the question, is communism a religion? And we discussed the matter for a long time with the disciple of Christ and the disciple of Lenin, talking freely and dispassionately about their views. The answer I found to the question on this Sunday afternoon in Rostov-on-Don was, yes, communism is a religion. It is a systematic religion which, in its highest ideal, believes that the state is God, work is worship, and a better social order is the promised land. It has its trinity, consisting of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, undergirding all of the foibles and blunders and inconsistencies of which we may rightly accuse the Soviets. The philosophy of these three men remains the cohesive force which keeps communism respected and intact. It is impossible to understand modern Russia without them. They came into the conversation again and again. Karl Marx, the father of communism, Friedrich Engels, the great collaborator, V.I. Lenin, the practical demonstrator. Soon the battle lines were drawn, not only across the wooden table, but across all of Russia, and as far as the girl was concerned, through all the world. The pastor spoke tenderly of Christ's concept of the fatherhood of God. The student parried it gently but positively with Marx's concept of the brotherhood of man, and not in any vague and idyllic sense, but in what she considered the cold hard facts of labor, production wages, and the personalization of the worker. Karl Marx's first person of the communist trinity was presented by the student as a realist who took 19th century social, political, and religious liberalism out of books and put it to work in people's lives. Marx was a Prussian, ruthlessly brilliant, and a revolutionary against tradition. The problem of religion played an important part in his early life. His parents followed the Jewish faith only superficially and became Protestants when Karl was 6. They felt they needed a religion for religion's sake. Karl, at 17, thought differently. Religion, according to his views, could be put on and taken off as easily as a jacket, and it was better to take it off. In fact, it was imperative to take it off and keep it off if you would be a good working materialist. That is what he was, a materialist. His religion was philosophical materialism. He dissected it, analyzed it, reformulated it, preached it, and sometimes almost lived it. Remember, he once warned a friend, "I am really not a very good Marxist," but he was an iconoclast, and proud of it. Before he was 24, 3 universities had felt the impact of his daring views, and one at least, the University of Jena in Thuringia, read his proclamation. In one word, "I hate all the gods." These were the words of Prometheus, the Titan, who stole fire from heaven and gave it to man. For this, Zeus chained Prometheus to a mountain and commanded a vulture daily gnaw at his liver until some god consented to die in Prometheus' stead. I could have read all sorts of symbolism into this in the arbor behind the parsonage, for it occurred to me that perhaps Christianity would have to die in communism's stead before the people realized what they had lost when they lost a vital, living faith. Marx, first person of the materialistic trinity, had stolen the fire. That is, he had taken away Christianity's appeal for the loyalties of a people. He had crossed the minds of youth with a challenging, formidable stride. He had commanded them to think, even at the expense of their dreams, and work though it meant denying themselves and destroying the old institutions even before the new had been tried. Yes, I could have read symbolism into Aeschylus, Prometheus, but communism is no symbol. It is starkly real, fiercely contemporary, having in it ideas that all too often jibe with Yu's deepest disillusionments, and agree with Yu's gravest discontent. Communism is tremendously vital in the life of someone like the student geophysicist who has intense ambition and who believes she has been called to build a better world. Communism is a religion with her, and with other young communists who have taken courses in the history of atheism, who have studied religion in the light of its relationship to class struggle, who have been shown the fallacies of faith and the negative influences of institutionalized Christianity, who have had it proved to them that materialism is founded on natural science and that Marxism is absolute truth. Throughout most of his 65 years, Marx was a dominant figure among political philosophers. He borrowed from Plato and plagiarized from John Locke, and owed more to Hegel than he could ever repay. He took the absolute idealism of Hegel and applied it to his own absolute realism. and whatever there is of the spiritual in Marxism was stolen fire from the German philosopher Hegel, who dominated the metaphysical views of the 19th century. We talked about Marxism, the student and I, through the unerring and consistent aid of my interpreter. He was a mechanism, a highly proficient working machine. In the realm of languages, the minister had lapsed into a protective silence, content to listen. Apparently he had been over this ground many times, had struggled with it in his mind, and wrestled with it in his heart. He sat there as if pondering how he could ever deny what he believed, or how, in the face of an overwhelming majority, which included the entire youth of Russia, he could formulate any convincing defense. Frequently he looked at me as if to ask how he could convey to me his feeling about the Russian Trinity, and the Trinity to which he had dedicated his life. To speak or to be silent, that was his problem. Sometimes he sighed, and his manner said, "There is no way out. I must hold my peace, even though my silence denies what I know to be true." So his granddaughter spoke. There were things she had to say, even if it might mean hurting the old man. Marx was challenging to her, and Christ was only a myth to her, and all of her training and indoctrination were along these lines. More than that, Marxist philosophy fit perfectly into her geophysical studies. It was Marx who first implied the eternal existence of matter. It was Marx who explained that the permanent basis of truth is objective reality. Yet it was not Marx alone who created the philosophical structure of communism. There was also the second person of the materialistic trinity, philosopher Friedrich Engels, who said unequivocally, "Karl Marx is a genius. He stands higher, sees farther, and takes a wider and quicker view than all the rest of us put together." Engels was a rich man's son. His father was a manufacturer of cotton goods in Manchester, England. In 1870, Engels and Marx founded the First International in London, which was a union dedicated to improve the lot of the working people. Behind it was the unfolding philosophy of materialism. Behind it was Hegel and the formidable force of a Hegelian idea, the dialectic. No one can appraise communism without an understanding of the dialectic. No one can appreciate what communism means, or understand Russian religion, or the lack of it, without considering the impressive power of the dialectic process. Hegel's dialectic method was a scientific approach to truth in the realm of ideas. This is what it meant. The first stage or statement of an idea is called the thesis. This thesis contains within itself its own contradiction, or antithesis. The clash of thesis and antithesis, much like a brainstorming session, results in a synthesis which, combining both thesis and antithesis, is much nearer truth than the original thesis. This process of thesis challenged by antithesis to effect a synthesis was Hegel's general concept of the dialectic. He acknowledged that he got the system from Plato and used it in the realm of idealism. Marx and Engels applied the dialectic in the field of realism. They got it from Hegel, and they put it to work in a way which gave history a new twist. They said that all life and nature can be explained best in the light of the dialectic. In fact, life and history proceed along a course set by the continual clash of thesis and antithesis, or as the process was called, the doctrine of opposites. Hegel said that ideas contained contradictory natures within themselves. Marx and Engels said that matter also contained its own contradictions. Hegel insisted that ideas were continually moving toward a higher truth through the dialectic. Marx and Engels said that the materialistic world is moving toward absolute truth by means of the same process, and they cited the struggle of class against class as their great example. A class of people, Engels insisted, is determined by the economic development of a given period, by the means of production, and by the theories of the time. Capitalism represents the thesis, the workers the antithesis. The new regime, which evolves out of the clash, is the synthesis. The synthesis itself again takes the form of a thesis. Soon it is again opposed by its antithesis, and another synthesis evolves. Truth, according to Marx and Engels, is found in each synthesis, but it is only relative truth. Absolute truth is found in only an ultimate synthesis. The world, said Engels, is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes. In the compelling style of the materialistic gospel which he and Marx wrote, they declared, eternity in time, infinity in space, mean from the start, and in the simple meaning of the words, that there is no end in any direction, neither forwards nor backwards. It is clear that the infinity, which has an end but no beginning, is neither more nor less infinite than that which has a beginning but no end. The material world is an infinite process, unrolling endlessly in time and in space. It was this type of mind, Engels' type, fluent and creative, coupled with the intellectual wizardry of Marx, that challenged thinking people, glamorized the masses, and was today making a strong bid for the souls of Russian youth, of the kind who sat with me in the parsonage arbor. It dawned upon me that communism might have conquered half the world, had it not insisted upon setting itself up above God. This was a stumbling block, which the masses would not tolerate in the 19th century, and which they would oppose again today. This was the frightening element in Marxism, and the silent specter in communism. By denying God, they made themselves superior to God. Marx and Engels would have none of him, nor would they let the people rest who had found solace and power in religious faith. Nor did the third person of the materialistic trinity let these people rest. Lenin, demonstrator of the dialectic, most important political figure of modern Russia, schoolmaster's son, brilliant lawyer, powerful speaker, incessant writer, the man who trained the one-time theological student, Stalin, and without whom the people might never have revolted. Lenin, like Marx, hated the gods. Fear created the gods, he cried. Fear before the force of capitalism, which is blind. All contemporary religions and churches, he told his audiences, all and every kind of religious organization, Marxism has always viewed as instruments of bourgeois reaction, serving as a defense of exploitation and for the doping of the working class. The struggle against religion cannot be limited to abstract ideological preaching. The party of the proletariat must be the spiritual leader in the struggle against all kinds of medievalism, including the official religion. The churches had to go. God had to go. The materialistic trinity demanded Lebensraum for its idea. The years of Lenin, 1870 to 1924, were filled with a ministry of atheism unparalleled anywhere in the world. If any modern Christian had had half his zeal, all of Russia could have been Christianized. Imprisonments, exile, his life almost constantly threatened, his mind filled with fury against the exploiters of the masses, continually accused of being a tool for Germany, he stormed the land with the slogan, "Peace to the huts and war to the palaces." "I do not preach war against God at all cost," Lenin said. "That only helps the priest and burgess. I am a materialist, that is, an enemy of religion. I am a dialectical materialist, that is, one who fights against religion, not in the abstract, not by means of abstract, purely theoretical propaganda, equally suited to all times and places, but concretely on the basis of the class struggle, actually proceeding a struggle which is educating the masses better than anything can do." And when the revolution broke, when Lenin incited the Bolshevik liberators to action, when the 10 days that shook the world jarred the sleeping religionist into terrorized action, the communist trinity blessed and sanctified the conquest. It is possible to conquer a country through power, but it can be held only by a philosophical ideal. This ideology Marx forged in the fury of his passion against the burgesses. Engels made it graphic and understandable. Lenin incorporated it into a party and branded it upon the consciousness of a nation. It became a faith, a doctrine, a religion beyond all religions, based not upon images, visions, and revelations, but upon the cold, hard facts of life and what men can do about them, with the intelligence at their command and the power at their disposal. The minister, the student, my interpreter, and I talked until late afternoon, but I doubt that we were any nearer reconciling Christianity and communism than when we started. I doubted whether they could ever be reconciled. There is a great gulf between a trinity of materialistic moderns who, in the words of Lenin, taught that the idea of God keeps people in slavery, and the man from Galilee who declared that fellowship with God sets men free. Did the interpreter think these could be reconciled? His single answer was the good, hard Russian, "Niet." But the cleavage between contemporary religions and Marxism is not always sharp and clear. There are areas in which they reluctantly meet, and sometimes tacitly agree. I realized, even as I sat in the parsonage yard, that these areas built a bridge between the apostle of Jesus and the disciple of Lenin. The reconciliations we talked about made sense to me, but I had the feeling if I ever put them into a book, I would be in for no end of criticism from good churchmen who have painted communism in the blackest black or the reddest red, and who picture Marx, Engels, and Lenin as bearded men in baggy pants who never had a constructive thought in their heads and never set forth a single original idea. Such critics were never more wrong, dangerous as the Russian Trinity may be, subversive as their plans may seem, deserving as they are of the titles God killers, church haters, and Antichrist. We should, by rights, understand where communism and religion tend to rub shoulders in our modern world. This is not to mollify the godless teaching of the materialistic Trinity, condone the action of the Bolsheviks, or respect the violent atheism of the Soviet. It is simply sitting for a moment at a listening post, so to speak, between an apostle of Christianity and a disciple of Lenin. First of all, communism has an ethic. It has ideals to live by and a code to live up to. I realized this again in my association with the young geophysicist and other young communists I had met and interviewed recently in Rostov-on-Don. I realized it in my acquaintance with the interpreter. These young people have a high moral code based upon the Platonic idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Membership in the Young Communist League enjoins a special devotion to morality, a morality which often borders on Puritanism. Lenin insisted it was unnecessary to base morality upon God, or what he called anything outside of human society. He based morality and ethics on the facts and needs of life, particularly as related to the struggle of the proletariat. A person should be good, he insisted, simply because he lives in a world with other human beings. Marxism believes there is a permanent basis of truth which can be arrived at over the long, hard route of the dialectic. This is, in a way, also not incompatible with Christian thought, at least that part of it which believes we advance through struggle and we learn through experience. Perhaps what Marxists call the leap in the dark is not what we construe as faith or revelation, but there is a touch of kinship between the two. We Christians, too, have our objective ideals. They are formed in our mind through sense perception, and the ideal thus formed lures us on. This, too, is to be found in the philosophical concept of communism. The communist speaks of his better world, his new social order, his workers' utopia. To the communist youth, this idealistic state is a kind of new kingdom, which the world has never known or seen. He believes it may have to be built upon force. It may require another revolution to lead men into a classless world. The Christian, too, has his idea of a better world. He sees it evolving out of love and understanding. The minister expressed the Christian viewpoint when he said, "If we believe in God, and if we believe we are all children of God, we have a working basis for the brotherhood of man." But, argued the student, religion makes a distinction between those whom you call children of God in one country, Religion recognizes a system of caste, in another a system of creeds, in another a system of color lines, in still another a system of economic distinctions. If you will examine religion more closely, mused the pastor, you will see that it is these very injustices and inequalities which religion seeks to overcome. You must distinguish also between true religion and false, just as you differentiate between true and false communism. In seeking for similarities between religion and communism, an interesting point of agreement was found to be man's independent search for truth. To many outside the USSR, the Soviet separation of church and state may be nothing but subterfuge or domination of religion by the government, or a trick to lead the church into total eclipse. Young communists think differently. They believe it is the honest fulfillment of Lenin's plea that the state must not concern itself with religion, and religious societies must not be bound to the state. Everyone must be absolutely free to profess whatever religion he likes, or to profess no religion. There must be no discrimination whatever in the rights of citizens on religious grounds. The minister noted another area where Christianity and communism might be reconciled. Marxism, though it denies God and does not see the universe as purposive, does nonetheless believe in an ordered world, a place where, according to Engels, nothing happens without a conscious purpose and an intended aim. But here the similarity seemed to end. The minister insisted that the world had purpose and intelligence, and that God had determined the nature of things in accordance with his law and plan. The communist student admitted no such infinite design. Her answer to the question of life was matter and motion. Everything in nature carried and perpetuated its own within itself. The pastor said, "It is divine law that governs the world." The student said, "It is chance." The clergyman contended that lasting knowledge comes through God, through a study of the Word, and perhaps even through preaching. The young communist reminded us politely that Lenin had insisted that no books, no preaching, no religion can possibly enlighten anyone unless he is first enlightened by the struggle against the evil of capitalism. My dilemma remained. Despite our long discussion, despite the tea and pastries and the skill of our interpreter, I still had the feeling that the minister was restrained by an unseen force which we in democratic countries have never known and cannot understand. His mind was not fully his own, and his opinions were those which 40 years of Soviet rule had steadily imposed. I suppose we in the USA accept our religious freedom too lightly because it has been attained too easily. Here was a man who had to be careful not to oversell religion or undersell his Lord, and the result was almost incomprehensible spiritual inhibition. Here, on the other hand, was a young communist with an atheistic conviction, also beyond the grasp of the Western mind. We in America have never been subjected to any teaching so complete and intensive, so designed to suppress and liquidate the natural quest of the individual for a relationship with something higher and greater than himself. It was almost with longing for an affirmative answer that she asked me whether I thought a truth could be arrived at by any other than the dialectic method, or that it could be proved by anything but science. I said that a mystical demonstration which takes a hopeless, useless life, as religion often does, and transforms it into a hopeful, useful life, also proves a truth. I suggested that it is no more fantastic to think of uselessness being changed to purpose than it is for matter to be changed into energy. She said it is not the same, but her grandfather spoke up eagerly and asked, "Why is it not the same?" "Because," she said confidently, "the discoveries of science can be seen even by the unbeliever, but the discoveries of faith must be seen by believers." I suggested that she was not a believer, but I felt sure she would have to admit she recognized her grandfather's faith and what religion had done for him. To this she replied, "My grandfather is a good man." The minister shook his head and smiled. At this point, Lorena arrived in a taxi, which the interpreter had ordered to bring her. She came into the parsonage yard, loaded with cameras, and decided the light was still good enough for several pictures. She had even brought my Polaroid, and we all had a good time talking about the wonders of science, and what a remarkable world we were living in, and there was no disagreement among us about that. But after our goodbyes, I felt a sense of loss and loneliness for both the minister and his talented granddaughter, especially for her because I wished she might have had the chance to talk with American students and American scientists, and learned their views on the place of God in contemporary science. I could not help thinking it was something of a tragedy that she knew so little about the strength of Christianity and so much about its weaknesses. It was something of a tragedy, too, that we who profess the faith often fail to live and demonstrate it. She had no belief in the value of spiritual contemplation, or the power of prayer, nor in the merit of one's relationship with a personal God. The idea of religion as worship had never actually occurred to her, and all of these were things which all of us Christians believe and all too few of us sincerely practice. In a way, I even felt a bit sorry for my interpreter, though I do not know why I should have. He was such a self-sufficient, capable person, and he seemed to respect all people regardless of their views or their place in life or their faith or lack of it. When we drove back to the hotel together, we were still talking about Jesus and Lenin, and about the need for man believing something and worshiping something. "Tell me frankly," I said, "do you never feel the need for God or religion?" His answer was, "Niet," and "niet" in Russian always seemed a bit more final and more severe than just plain no. Chapter 5. Lonely are the godless. On a Sunday afternoon in Rostov-on-Don, I went around to the Cathedral of St. Alexander Nevsky, which was open for worship, and bought an icon I had looked at several times before. There are vending counters in most Russian Orthodox churches where you can buy candles and sacred bread and occasionally an ancient icon. The price for this one was certainly right, about $20 in American money, but the size and weight had me hesitate. It was a bronze-framed head of Christ in a 16 by 16 inch glass-enclosed shadow box, inlaid with strips of polished copper. The halo encircling the dark and brooding face sparkled with gems. above which was a miniature dove of peace, skillfully carved. The icon weighed about 8 pounds, was evidently quite old, and one of the finest I had seen for sale. As I walked out of the church with it, a great crowd of worshippers followed me. Even several beggars hobbled to their feet, indicating they wanted to examine the icon and honor it. So I held it up, and they made the sign of the cross and murmured prayers I did not understand. One old woman started to cry, and a crippled woman came forward and kissed the glass door that covered the messianic face. Religion, as far as these people were concerned, was still explosive with emotional appeal. Evidently, their religious impulse had not been sublimated in the state. They were determined to honor the Christ and inform me by signs and phrases that my icon was the counterpart of worship. They believed there was holiness attached to it, and power emanating from it, and fortunate was I for having procured it for my very own. A smartly dressed Russian woman, coming from the church, stopped to ask in English if she could be of any assistance. She remained for a moment, a striking contrast to the predominantly peasant worshippers. She explained that there was both veneration and superstition connected with icons, and even a belief that some icons were not man-made at all, but had come down from heaven. These, of course, were especially effective in working miracles. Some of the people I suggested certainly acted as though mine might be one of them. "I don't think so," she laughed. "These people are just naturally religious." With this, she walked away, leaving the icon the center of attraction. These, of course, were old people, pre-revolution religionists. I wondered what the icon would mean to the 80 million young fledglings of Mother Russia who know Christ only as a myth and have been taught systematically that religion is but an instrument of oppression. I found out what it meant to one of them when I got to my hotel, and laid my purchase momentarily on the manager's desk. A young Russian student spied it and came over for a closer look. I asked him what he thought of it. He shrugged, smiled patiently, and said, "It's not an Andrew Rublev." This was certainly true. Rublev was the master icon maker of the 15th century, and his works are priceless. Then the young man wanted to know what I was going to do with it, since I was not orthodox. When I explained that I collect all sorts of religious objects, he looked at me in bewilderment. Such articles have no function, he figured, and since they merely perpetuate superstition, they should be put into museums. The government has the right idea, he believed, in preserving religious art treasures to show the folly and extravagances of the early churchmen, and to remind people of the unbounded greed of the czars. During our visit together, I put to him several questions, which I had been asking wherever I had the chance. Does communism satisfy an impulse to worship and a will to believe in something or someone higher and greater than oneself? Is communism a valid substitute for religion? His answer was typical. Religion is false. Communism is true, of course. Communism satisfies me. What more do I need? What more is there? We have it all. Nonetheless, he was quite interested in my field of research. I again sensed a genuine curiosity about the religious life and about my ideas on religion. He began to query me on why I engaged in this kind of work and what the relationship between religion and American life actually is. Whether all this was mere curiosity or a secret longing was difficult to say. I rather suspect it was a genuine interest in the religious phenomenon, as we know it in America, and a certain wonder about the startling fact that we Americans cannot conceive of a country without God or devoid of what we call the spiritual ingredient. He wanted to know if I really believe that a nation cannot exist without God. I said that was one reason I had come to Russia. His response was typical. He gave a low murmur of incredulous, thoughtful wonder. Why couldn't a nation exist without God? How, he wanted to know, would I explain that nations with God often failed? Nations with God were guilty of more sins than Russia could ever be. Nations with God had appallingly bad records, he thought. Once he reminded me when a Christian accused an atheist of invoking God's wrath to the extent that a great drought covered the land, the atheist said, "Why doesn't God permit rain to fall on your land at least?" God or no God, he insisted, what happens to one person happens to all. The Pope dies just the same as anyone else, and the patriarchs were just as eager to keep on living as was the lowliest peasant. And he maintained there is no difference between Russia and America, either except, of course, that Russia is superior and more advanced. He could not get over the fact that America is still so saturated with religion. It was a great mystery to him, as great a mystery as Russia's religious void is to me. We did find several areas of agreement about the contrast between our two countries. We agreed that whereas in America it is fashionable to belong to a church, in Russia it is more fashionable to stay away. In America it is honorable to love God and revere Christ. In Russia, it is officially more honorable to deny God and ignore Christ. In America, religion is applied to life, integrated in life, and considered an essential part of life. In Russia, religion is shunned. We have made religion vocal and newsworthy. The Soviets have banned it from their radio and press. These things we agreed on. As I sat with my icon on my lap, talking about religion to this friendly young communist, I wondered how he would react if he were suddenly transported to America for a quick look at some of the fantastic expressions of American faith. Imagine him getting a glimpse of the flamboyant highway signs, "Jesus is coming," "Are you ready?" or the all-too-familiar, "Where will you spend eternity?" What if he saw "Jesus saves" scribbled on rocks across the length and breadth of our countryside, or noted, "Listen, sinner, God is waiting," despoiling an overhanging cliff? We take these things as a matter of course. We even put up crosses to mark the spots where people have met death on hills and curves. This young man had never seen the inside of a church. What if I were to show him one of our Saturday night church pages, the Los Angeles Times, let us say, or what if he were to hear the religious songs on our jukeboxes, or the prayers that open and close many of our radio stations? Or what if he viewed a spiritual healing service on TV, or heard the radio recitation of Hail Mary, full of grace, or if he were exposed to the religious beat included in a floor show, or heard our politicians when they waxed evangelist or joined in singing when the saints go marching in. Happily, before I was tempted to describe the enigma and wonder of our kaleidoscopic pattern of faith, a taxi came to take Lorena and me to the Rostov dock. We were booked for a 3-day steamer trip up the Don and Volga rivers to Stalingrad. I said goodbye to the student. He offered to carry the icon out to the cab, which I thought was a courteous act and quite a concession on his part. And, as was often the case, when we parted and I asked his name, the answer was, "It does not matter. We will probably not meet again, but it was nice to have met someone from America." The elderly porter who helped us put our baggage into our 6-foot by 8-foot cabin stood in absolute awe when I propped the icon on the little writing table. He was in his 70s, attired in a tight-fitting black suit, with a black cap pushed back over his white hair. Definitely a pre-revolutionist Christian. He shook his head and purred in wonder at my Rublov. His wrinkled face took on an ecstatic expression when I indicated the icon was to stay on the table for the duration of the trip. He doffed his cap and started to make the sign of the cross, looking at me as if asking whether I too was of the faith. He touched his forehead, his breast, his right shoulder, and his left, and bowed low. With signs and words he inquired where I had got this possession and why. I managed to tell him, and he nodded and murmured over the icon again. Certainly for him the symbols of faith had never died, and the impulse to worship was still at his fingertips. Shaking his head and commenting on the icon, he started to leave. I tried to tip him, but he was offended. With exaggerated gestures, he seemed to say, "How could I accept any money in his presence?" So he hurried away, thanking me for whatever I had done for him. There was no question about the quality of these Russian peasants. They were sensitive, gentle, long-suffering, and kind. The hold of our modern 2-decker steamer was full of these muzhiks, as the peasants are called. Lorena and I passed through their quarters when we came aboard. 100 or more men and women were patiently trying to make themselves comfortable on the floor, hemmed in by bundles and baskets, amid coils of rope and boxes of freight. Here below, where they were riding, the heat was intense, and the stench from the washrooms almost unbearable. Our first-class cabin on the second deck was pure luxury compared with steerage, where the peasants rode. Communist Russia is still a long way from a classless society. We had 2 comfortable bunks, a wash basin, and a handy clothes closet. A small dining room for first-class passengers, about 80 of us, was located astern, and up front was a lounge with chess tables, an upright piano, and ubiquitous, heavy red plush draperies on a large circular windows. Our traveling companions included Russians from various republics, most of them on a workman's holiday, a group of teenagers, and several well-dressed Russian families. The head of a textile factory in Kharkov had told us that in the Soviet Union, everyone who works gets an annual vacation with full pay. The average vacation is 2 weeks. But people who do heavy work may get as much as 5 weeks. People who need medical attention can take their holidays at a health resort and arrange for free special treatment. All summer resorts and sanatoria are operated by the government under the Ministry of Public Health. The peasants down below, whom Lorena and I called the icon lovers, were not on vacation. They lived in settlements along the river and had been to Rostov-on-Don for trading purposes, riding steerage for a few rubles. The river steamer was a symbol of the contrast between old Russia and the new, between the icon lovers down under and the iconoclasts on the upper deck. Here were two worlds, the long-suffering, pack-burdened travelers, and the carefree, strolling crowds who enjoyed, as we did, the beginning of our upstream conquest of the 1,000-mile-long Don. Here, too, was a graphic lesson in Russian religion, whereas the old Tsarist regime had assured its icon-loving subjects that religion and suffering were inseparable. Iconoclastic communism was telling its people that all talk about being patient under adversity has ever been a capitalistic plot. Happiness, said the party line, has nothing to do with holiness, and joy is by no means a byproduct of faith. While I occupied myself with thoughts of this kind, and while Lorena roamed the deck taking pictures, a good destiny led me into the company of two passengers who spoke English. The young woman, Raya, good-looking and primly dressed, was a secretary in a Stalingrad governmental office. Joseph, a Ukrainian, was a foreman in a tractor plant. We sat together in the comfortable lounge, while the peaceful countryside, with its meadows and cattle ranges, slowly unfolded on either side of the narrow Don. Children played on the sandy banks, and occasionally we passed a quiet village, whose whitewashed homes glistened in the afternoon sun. My newly found friends were actually eager to talk about religion when they learned my purpose in coming to Russia. They told me soberly they were anti-Christ, and saw no reason why they should be anything else. They too contended that communism was spiritually satisfying, that it had its moral and ethical standards, and that it adequately explained the meaning of life. They were happy and adjusted in their knowledge of it. We decided that American religion, in its modern emphasis, had at least one element in common with Russian atheism. To most of us Americans, Christianity has come to mean a happy adjustment to life, and is designed to help us acquire abundant living, peace of mind and soul. We, in the Western world, no longer believe that the Lord chastens those he loves. We believe he blesses people. We even go so far as to suggest that God wants his children to be well-to-do. If the Soviets are in league with dialectic materialism in order to find happiness, we, in the Western world, are in league with Christian materialism to reach a similar goal. While we talked along these lines, Joseph took pains to remind me that if American religion is justified because it makes people happy, then anything that makes people happy is justified, and anything so justified is undeniably religious. But belief in God, as far as he was concerned, is either an indication of an inferiority complex, or self-delusion, or a plot of some kind. Christianity, he contended, is founded upon premises which are untrue, or upon propositions which cannot be logically proved. Christians, in his opinion, are people who think that by talking and preaching about morality, they automatically become more moral than non-Christians. Despite all this, he and Raya were interested in seeing my Rublev. They were also somewhat fascinated by the dubious fact that I was ready to cart a religious relic through the USSR. They accompanied me to our cabin, examined the icon critically, and were quite impressed. Raya wanted to know what it cost. She said that when she was a child, her parents had an icon in their home. It was gone now, a casualty of the war. So you collect things like this, Joseph said. Does that make you more religious? I never thought about it one way or the other, I confessed. I do it as a hobby. And you and you keep adding and adding to your hobby. When do you have enough? I told him his question reminded me of what a Hutterite once asked me when he visited our home. I'd proudly showed the Hutterite my collection of some 200 rare colored cruets, after he had looked at them for a long while, without voicing an opinion. I asked him what he thought of them. He replied, "They are very nice, but what do you want with so many?" "Good for him," exclaimed Raya. "That was a very good question." Then she and Joseph asked who the Hutterites were. I explained that they are people in the United States and Canada who live communistically. Communistically, they exclaimed in unison. "What do you mean?" "Didn't you know," I said amused, "that we have communal societies in the United States? Communistic experiments have been tried in our country for more than 100 years, and they are still being tried." Frankly suspicious, they asked for more information. I explained that throughout the history of America, certain groups had given the communistic life a serious try. I informed them that mutualistic living, according to a communal pattern, had been attempted in our country 129 times. At least I had a record of 129 such adventures. In communism, they included the monocolonies, the Shakers, the Perfectionists, the Acarians, and the many others who had insisted it is possible to create a classless society and live more happily collectivistically than under free enterprise. My listeners sat entranced. "Come, come," said Joseph, "is this actually true?" I assured him it was. These experiments were indeed communistic to the extent that all property was owned by the group. The members sought security more than freedom, were willing to be regimented, invested their energies and talents and time in the improvement not of self but of their society, believed wholeheartedly or said they did, that cooperative living, which renounced private enterprise, constituted a more advanced economic and ethical system than any ever proposed or produced under capitalism. My Russian couple could not believe I was telling the truth. Would a country like America permit anyone to adventure in communism? Preposterous! All they had ever heard was that America refused communists permission even to visit the United States, and that we accused every last one of them of subversion. I do not know about that, I told them, but I do know that of the 129 attempts at communistic living, 128 have failed. 128 of them had given communism an unhindered trial, some for 50 years, some for 20, some for only a year or two. Then they gave way to private enterprise and embraced the American way. Only the Hutterites, who came to America from the Ukraine in 1874, still persist. They are hanging on doggedly and desperately, trying to prove that a classless society is possible. Was their experiment growing? Yes, from within. The Hutterites are the most prolific people in all the world, but I had to explain that even the redoubtable Hutterites, the last of the communistic experimenters in the Western world, are now in transition and are beginning to be considerably more capitalistic than communistic in their outlook and practices. I had never realized how significant these communal attempts were until I discussed them in the presence of my two Russian friends. It had never quite dawned on me that the minority experiment of the Hutterians actually represents a little Russia, in its insistence that the commune life is more important than the fate of the individuals who compose it. It is a little Russia in its ironclad discipline, its exclusiveness, and its authority, whereby the commune bosses allocate the work and set the wages and regulate the activities for their captive subjects. The Hutterites are like a huge collective farm. They are a miniature USSR, with the great exception that they are avowedly Christian. This, I had to tell my friends, is the major difference between the Hutterites and the Soviets. There is a saying, under God, communism thrives among the Hutterites. Without God, it fails in Russia. The Hutterites claim they are living according to a scriptural injunction which affirms that the early Christians had all things in common. That, exclaimed Joseph with a hearty laugh, is a Burgess justification if I ever heard one. Certainly it is a claim we have never made. We do not need the Bible to justify our system. It can be justified on the basis of progress and common sense. At this point, Lorena came in to change films in her Medalist and Leica. Her moods are usually measured by her luck with the cameras, and I knew from her attitude that things were going well. Wherever we went in the world, the first line she learned in the native language was, "Please, may I take your picture?" She tried it out in Russian on Raya and Joseph, and they were delighted. So off we went to the deck. The river was beautiful, the meadows on either side peaceful, almost idyllic, with an occasional glimpse of small adobe-like homes and roving cattle of a collective farm, tugs bearing lumber and grain and oil drifted past us downstream. The Russian passengers seemed as thrilled as we with the start of the trip. They stood watching their land unfold before them. Parents pointed out scenes to their children. Young couples strolled the deck hand in hand, and the group of teenagers was in a real holiday mood. Their trip, I was told, was a reward for work well done at a Rostov school. As I mingled in the crowd and felt myself a part of it, I again realized that people are pretty much the same all over the world, ourselves included. But this only deepened the Russian mystery. Atheistic materialism insisted, in effect, that one should never say to oneself, behind the world with all its beauty is the great designer. Instead, it told its subjects, when you walk with nature, it is foolish to think there is someone within all of this with whom you can identify yourself. When you watch the clouds or behold a sunset, it is silly sentimentality to say, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. And when you are caused to suffer with nature, never meditate on the meaning or try to find anything redemptive in the experience. It is only a delusion to think that someone is saying, "Fear not, I am with thee." It was difficult to remain objective when I contemplated religion and the Soviets. Was communism interested in anything higher than that which can be attained through work and human planning? Was there ever any rising above sensory perception? Think of a nation robbing its people of the fellowship of God. Think of the audacity of men who reduce the love of Christ to fiction. With these thoughts plaguing me, I went into the cabin and jotted down my reactions. Clipboard in hand, I made myself comfortable on the cot, gave the icon a glance, and impulsively put down the following impression. Communism is totally rationalistic, thinks only of this life, plans only in terms of physical needs. Birth to the communist is a biological phenomenon. Life, an inexplicable mystery. Man, the product of his environment, and death, the final, inevitable extinction. Life's only purpose, according to the communist line, is to make men more realistic, so that they may better adapt themselves to what must ever be an existence without spiritual hope, and an aimless journey into nowhere. While I was stubbornly convincing myself of these things, and recording them, I was also asking myself whether all this was any reason for opposing communism, or fearing it, or wanting it destroyed. But what right did I condemn the Russian if he wished to follow his Trinity instead of mine? If he had a complete cynicism about objective truth, that was his business. I reminded myself that if it is really true that no nation can exist without God, then communism will ultimately destroy itself by reaping the atheistic whirlwind it has sown. I had always been taught that it is not enough to understand only the evident and the seen. It is necessary to arrive at some idea of the essence of things, the unseen, where there is no vision. My thoughts were cut short abruptly by a song, a thrilling, wonderful song full of joy. The group of teenagers was putting on a spontaneous concert, and Lorena swung open the door, calling me to come out. Thoughtfully, I reread what I had written. Communism is totally rationalistic. The singing flooded the cabin. It reminded me of the stirring Russian dokobor, songs which I had recorded in British Columbia. I thought about these people, fugitives from their homeland, fanatically religious according to our point of view, mad about God and wordless as the Hutterites. I thought about the choir rehearsal in Kharkov when the group of Baptist believers sang Silent Night. I thought of the church-going peasants in the Cathedral of St. Nikolai and at Petrovskaya and in other churches I had visited. I remembered the students who always had a searching light in their eyes when I talked about religion and asked them about their deepest beliefs. I wondered how anyone could determine the depth of spiritual feeling or measure the capacity for faith in any individual. What is religion? What should it do? How can you define it, and by what standard can you appraise whether it is wholly true or wholly false? All this while the icon remained inscrutable, and the solemn, thoughtful face of the Messiah said nothing more than, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." I joined Lorena on the deck where the concert was in progress. Singing, as was proved in the Baptist church in Kharkov, is certainly not my forte, and Lorena again took advantage of every excuse to hide behind her camera. But here the informality and my almost forgotten experience with a barbershop quartet finally paid off. At least, it proved conclusively that nothing is quite as universal as a good song, and there is no better portfolio of goodwill than a repertory of folk tunes and spirituals. Home on the range brought the Russians on board closer to the spirit of America than any diplomatic speech, and the Volga boat song took us nearer to the heart of the Russian people than any guided tour could possibly have done. Incidentally, when the Porgy and Bess Company came to the Soviet Union several years ago, they did more to break up the Hate America program than any other method had ever been able to do. People in Leningrad wept when the Porgy and Bess players left town, and at Christmas time Radio Russia broadcast carols sung by the company. The first time songs of the Christmas tide had been heard on a communist radio since the Revolution of 1917. "Russia loves a heart that sings" was Raya's translation of a passenger's comment, and I requested her to tell him that this sentiment was shared by Americans as well. That evening we had a song fest in the lounge, and the following night another, in the midst of a storm, while the boat twisted and tossed. We were again entertained by the singers, and tried to entertain them in return. By then we had left the channel of the Don to enter what Russia claims is the largest man-made sea in the world, the Sea of Tizimlyansko, 20 miles wide and 110 miles long. It is reached through a series of huge locks, claimed by the Soviets to be the biggest and most magnificent that man has ever made. Photographing the locks was strictly forbidden, but Lorena's fingers were itching to include them in her pictorial documentary. Making the approach to each and every lock were monuments 60 and 80 feet high. They were actually marble pillars surmounted by statuary. Most spectacular among them was the towering statue of Stalin, emerging prophet-like from the horizon at the entrance to the Volga. My casualty in the storm was one broken icon. When I returned to our quarters, I found my Rublev face down on the floor in the midst of broken glass. I picked up the splintered frame and the few jewels which had fallen out, and was happy to discover that the brooding face and the dove of peace had not been desecrated. The incident seemed to me a sentimental symbol of religion in Russia, as if the storm might have been the hand of Marx, flinging down the icon to the accompaniment of his notorious phrase, "I hate the gods." I wiped the bits of glass from the face and set it back once more on the writing table. We had just now entered the Volga, the mother of Russian rivers. I looked out at the barren eastern shore, the region of the vast steppes running down to the Caspian Sea, against which lumber barges were moving with their huge cargoes. The sun was brilliant. The water of the river was a powerful eternal force. I thought of the Ganges and the Jordan and the Nile, holy rivers which Lorena had photographed. If Russia has a holy river, it is the Mother Volga. The passengers on our deck, even those to whom the trip was a commonplace, were reverently silent. Mother Volga is a romantic river, steeped in legend and history. A chapel marks the spot where it rises in the Valdai Hills, along its 2,400-mile journey to the sea. It flows past the shadows of cathedral domes and monastery walls. Up this longest river in Europe came the invading Tartars, while the Russian defenders were borne down on its crest to oppose them. The Germans fought for control of the Volga in World War II, and the destruction of 1,000 vessels filled the waters with Russian dead, a legend probably confused with Marco Polo's narratives, related that at certain points where convent grounds touched the Volga's edge, fish appear on the first day of Lent, remain until Easter Sunday, and then disappear as miraculously as they came. Faith in a river, perhaps, I told myself. Religion in Russia is like the Volga, which cannot be held back or conquered or despoiled. But like the Volga, spiritual faith in Russia is full of governmental locks, a secretly constructed dam or two, and a man-made sea. The locks in Russia's river of faith are governmental restrictions, some official, some psychological. The dams are the unyielding control of church property by the state, and the state's rigid hold on the growth of organized religion. It can regulate it at will. It can hold it at a desired level. It can utilize its power. The man-made sea in Russian religion is modern Russian orthodoxy, wittingly or unwittingly the ready tool of the state. Russian orthodoxy today represents a religious nationalism, fully as thorough as it was in the days of the czars. The church is free only within the limit of the law which governs it. A governmental council works with the Orthodox denomination, and a similar council works with non-Orthodox bodies, and this too is part of the man-made sea. The river of faith is communist-controlled. There is freedom of worship in Russia only as far as freedom is granted. There are no church organizations as we know them in America, no young people's groups, laymen's movements, missionary activities, evangelistic crusades, or Sunday schools are allowed. No minister or priest preaches a social gospel unless it follows the party line. No public function ever includes prayer. No religious leader dares criticize the government. No Communist Party member may join a church. Still, the Volga flowed, and the symbolism I read into it made me wonder if religion could possibly be held back. Who could read the soul of the Russian people? Who could say whether or not God was being worshipped in the private lives of those I had met? Were the masses biding their time, believing and praying that atheistic materialism would inevitably defeat itself? Was Russia, once the world's most fervently religious nation, still spiritual at heart? Shortly before we reached Stalingrad, I had another partial, isolated answer to these questions. Joseph, the factory foreman, returned to my cabin. He came under the pretense of saying goodbye, but he tarried for a long time at the door. For a time we talked about the storm. Did I know that Tzimlyanskoye Sea was formed by the largest earthen dam in the world, nearly 10 miles long, with a height of over 100 feet? Was I aware of the fact that the joining of the Don and the Volga had created a continuous water connection of 50,000 kilometers, and that it had tremendous irrigational and hydroelectrical as well as transportational functions? The canal, I was told, consisted of 13 locks, and what an engineering feat it was became evident only when I remembered that the Don is 40 meters higher than the Volga. The concept of such a canal went back to the days of Peter the Great, Joseph informed me, but it remained for the Communists to achieve it as the result of skill and the 5-year plan in 1951-55. It now linked the Black, Caspian, Baltic, and White Seas, and had great naval and military significance, which he explained was the reason that pictures of the locks were prohibited. But actually it was not the canal he wanted to talk about. It was, I soon realized, the Volga, by which I mean the flowing stream of faith. It was religion that he got around to eventually, and the icon served as his excuse. When he noticed it was broken, he walked over to it, asking me what had happened. Then he offered to lend a hand at straightening and replacing the strips of copper inlay which had become disengaged from the frame. Eagerly and quite expertly he set to work, bending over the icon so that I could not see his face. He inquired, "Tell me, are Americans truly very religious?" I told him I thought so. Without looking up, he asked, "What do you mean when you say they are religious? Are they different from us? Are they better than we are? Are they happier? What does religion do for them?" I explained that Americans believe that trust in God gives stability, security, and order to our individual and national lives. Separately and collectively, we are convinced that God figures in our destiny. My personal feeling in that religion gives dignity to life, and that our freedom is encompassed within our concept of God. He wanted to know how we acquired this freedom, how it works, and whether I honestly believe that God exists. What proof did I or anyone have of God's existence, and what did I think about some ultimate purpose within the universe, and what were my views on life after death? There was little doubt about it. He was on as much of a spiritual quest as were the rest of us. The difference was, of course, that he found himself in a country where open inquiry about religion was unpopular, but his atheistic indoctrination had not blacked out the will to believe, or at least the wish to do so. a pretense of not really caring too much, a make-believe effort to repair the icon with difficulty when the task was actually quite easy, a casual remark. All of these could not hide the universal truth that man is by nature spiritual, and something deep down within him is going to give God an upward look. Nothing will get in the way of that, Joseph's attitude seemed to indicate. Not even space satellites. I felt just then that if this man is typical of most Russians, the Gordian knot of atheistic bondage is someday going to be cut in this incredible laboratory of unbelief, the Soviet Union. The similarity between Joseph and any man in any country who keeps his religious questing under cover was remarkable. He was again convincing me that wherever man lives, man worships or thinks about worship, and the centuries during which men's minds have wrestled with the divine mystery have not stopped with any stated time, not been abandoned at the borders of any particular place. Religion is part of the developing experience of every individual, Joseph included. All of this persuaded me to say to him, "You asked whether Americans are different from Russians, who are not religious. Let me ask you whether you are convinced that Russians are not religious." He looked out of the window to where the Volga flowed, and finally said, "What do you think?" "I think Russians, like any other people, are religious by nature." "You may be right," he said. "You may be right, and there may be no other way about it. A person can never get away from at least thinking and wondering about it." He feigned a laugh. "We cannot even get away from this fellow," he said. "Who?" He indicated the icon. "This one." He leaned back, looked at it a moment, clamped his hands down on the writing desk, and got up. "That's the best I can do with it," he said. "When you get to America, it can be repaired." He propped the icon up in its place, said he was glad we had been together on the trip, and walked out abruptly. In a moment, the ship's whistle blew sharply. I looked out at the dock, and beyond the dock, to a terraced embankment and seemingly acres of wide, white marble steps, massive colonnades, white and clean, surmounted by symbols of winged victory, rose towering and strong against the open sky. Lorena rushed in excitedly in search of her wide-angle lens. She had been told that pictures of this dazzling approach to Stalingrad were allowed. Did I know that what were now marbled terraces and huge Corinthian columns had once been the site of a solid skyline of business places? Had anyone told me that 100,000 air raids had been launched against this city? Did I realize that here the pick of Hitler's armies had been pledged to drive the Russians into the Volga, and that it was here that Stalin called upon the people of the church to pray? And had I heard the saying that he who comes to Stalingrad without faith will find it here? The porter came in for our bags. The ship was at the dock. I tucked my treasured Rublev under my arm and went outside with a feeling strangely akin to coming home.